A man is falling from a 50-story building. And as he passes each floor, he just keeps reassuring himself, saying, so far, so good. So far, so good.
Right, but it is not the fall that kills you. It is the landing.
Exactly. And that is such a chilling, perfect metaphor to open with. I mean, welcome to today's deep dive, everyone.
Yeah, we are so glad you are here with us.
Because today, we're going to explore exactly what happens when an entire society realizes it is the one in free fall. You know, we have a really fascinating, honestly, pretty dense stack of sources in front of us today for you.
We really do. We are pulling from deep dive film analyses, historical urban planning documents, sociological research, and some modern journalistic pieces too.
Right. And all of this material revolves around one central gravitational pull. And that is Matthew Kasowitz's explosive 1995 film, Haine, which translates to hate.
It is a piece of cinema that is, well, technically decades old now, yet when you watch it, I mean, it feels like a documentary that was shot yesterday morning.
Which is exactly what we are here to figure out. The mission of this deep dive is to examine how a black and white indie film about 3 kids just like killing time in the Parisian suburbs became this terrifyingly accurate prophetic blueprint.
A blueprint for literally decades of systemic inequality.
Right, exactly. Inequality, police brutality, and the deep fracturing of French national identity. And I do want to make something super clear right up front for you listening.
Yes, please do, because this is important.
Looking at this stack of sources today, which covers everything from the rise of the far-right National Front to religious radicalism and the intense friction between marginalized youth and the police, we are not here to play politics.
No, not at all.
We are strictly using these historical and sociological sources as a magnifying glass. We are not taking sides, and we are not endorsing any political viewpoints, whether that is left or right.
Right. Our goal is strictly to synthesize the mechanisms presented in your sources. We just want to help you understand the why behind these global societal fractures.
Because honestly, the forces that isolate people, the things that strip away their hope and ultimately lead to violence, those mechanisms are completely universal. They're not just confined to a single Parisian suburb.
Oh, you see them everywhere, in the U.S., in the U.K., all over.
So, to figure out how a modern democracy accidentally engineers its own social explosions, we kind of have to start with the dirt it is built on.
The actual physical environment.
Yeah. If the psychological environment of these youth is a trap, how did the physical environment get built to hold them? I mean, when anyone thinks of Paris, you know, they think of the Eiffel Tower, the sweeping boulevards, the impossibly romantic cafes.
City of light. And, well, that image is very real, but it is highly curated.
Curated how?
Well, that center of Paris was largely designed in the mid-19th century by Baron Haussmann under Napoleon III. He basically demolished the old, narrow, medieval streets to build those wide, majestic boulevards.
Right, the ones you see in all the postcards.
Exactly. It was built for flow, for grandeur, and to preserve a very specific elite French aesthetic. Today, Central Paris functions almost like a living museum. I mean, it is fiercely protected.
But then you leave that museum. You take a commuter train out past the ring road, into the peripheries, out to the banlieues, and reading through the urban planning sources, I mean, the contrast is violent.
It really is a shock to the system.
It is not a gradual fade from wealth to middle class to poor. It is just a cliff edge.
It is a cliff edge, both aesthetically and socially. And we should probably clarify something about the term banlieue.
Oh, yeah, good point.
Because to an American ear, like the word suburb implies a quiet, leafy neighborhood with a 2-car garage and good schools right outside the city, a place you escape to for safety.
Right, the classic American dream setup.
Exactly. But in France, the banlieues, specifically the cités, which are the massive concrete housing projects within them, they are the exact opposite. They are where the working poor were pushed out to.
Pushed out and basically walled off. And the architecture of these projects was not just some cheap accident. They were heavily influenced by the Swiss-French architect Le Corbusier in a post-World War II boom.
Yes, his whole modernist philosophy.
Right, and he had this philosophy that a home should be a machine for living, which, I have to be honest, sounds like something a dystopian artificial intelligence would say.
It really does. It is an incredibly cold philosophy when applied to vulnerable populations. The idea was to create totalitarian modernism, functionalism above absolutely everything else.
Wait, so what does that actually look like on the ground?
Well, Le Corbusier and his disciples believed you should separate residential zones completely from the cultural and economic life of the city. So you get these straight lines, massive towers, right angles, and concrete blocks dumped literally in the middle of nowhere.
Wow.
Yeah. The architecture, physically manifests what sociologists and our sources call advanced marginality.
Advanced marginality. I am trying to visualize how this actually functions. It is almost like Paris was designed as an exclusive VIP lounge, and the banlieues are just the concrete waiting room outside.
That is a great analogy.
But it is like the architects forgot to build any doors leading into the club. If these housing projects were built as functional machines for a workforce, didn't the planners realize what happens to a machine when the power gets cut? Like when the industrial work dries up?
That is the exact blind spot that created the crisis. Because you have to look at who was placed in those machines.
Okay, lay it out for me. Who was living there?
Well, following the collapse of the French Empire in the mid-20th century, the era of the France d'outre-mer, or overseas France, you had massive waves of immigrants arriving. They were coming from former colonies in North and West Africa.
And they just funneled them straight into these peripheral concrete blocks.
Yes. So you have a massive demographic shift, former colonial subjects moving into the metropolitan center of the empire that used to rule them.
And I imagine the historical attitude of the colonizer didn't just, evaporate when the geographical borders changed.
It definitely did not. Historically, the French colonial project was justified by the mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission.
That's just such a loaded term.
It is deeply paternalistic and inherently racist. It was the idea that the French were bringing enlightenment and culture to inferior colonized peoples.
So when those populations physically moved to France, that condescending attitude just packed its bags and came right with them.
Exactly. They transitioned from colonial subjects to second-class citizens or just foreigners in the very country that invited them over to rebuild its post-war economy.
And the architecture reinforces this denial of humanity, right?
Completely. The absolute lack of aesthetic care, the lack of traditional French architectural markers in the banlieue, it represents a literal denial of French identity and culture to these minority groups. They are kept a train right away, totally out of sight.
And if the train stops running, or you miss the last one, which, by the way, is a major plot point in the film Haine, you are physically locked out of the capital. It is physical isolation functioning as a psychological trap.
It creates a pressure cooker environment.
Right. So if the physical environment is essentially a concrete prison, how on earth do you capture that psychological weight on camera without it just looking like a depressing evening news report?
This is where we have to dive into the optics of despair. Mathieu Kassovitz and his cinematographer Pierre Haine made some incredible visual choices. They elevated what could have been a gritty street narrative into a timeless piece of high art.
And the most obvious striking choice they made is that Haine is shot entirely in high contrast black and white.
Which is fascinating for a film made in 1995.
Yeah, for a movie about modern street kids, that was a massive financial and artistic risk. You would think shooting a poverty-stricken area in color would make it feel more visceral, like more real. Why strip all the color away?
Because if you shoot it in gritty, handheld color, it becomes a documentary. It just becomes a news segment you watch on a Tuesday night and forget by Wednesday morning.
Oh, I see.
By shooting in black and white, Kassovitz deliberately distances the film from raw realism. He shifts it into a cinematic tradition called poetic realism. It mythologizes the characters, making their struggle feel timeless.
And it serves a huge metaphorical purpose too, right?
Yeah.
I was reading through the visual analysis in the stack, and the black and white photography literally forces the viewer to see the world as polarized.
Yes, exactly.
It underscores the black and white nature of their reality. There is no gray area in their lives. There is us and them, the youth and the police, the suburbs in the center.
Absolutely. The monochrome drains the life and the warmth out of the environment, forcing you to focus entirely on the bleakness of the concrete. You just see the raw emotion on the characters' faces.
It highlights that feeling of a dead end.
Right. But where the cinematography gets truly brilliant is in the mechanics of the camera lenses. Haine literally weaponizes the glass of the camera against the characters.
Okay, break this down for me because this blew my mind in the notes. How does a camera lens trap a character?
It all comes down to focal length. When the three main characters are in their home territory, the banlieue, Haine almost exclusively uses ultra-wide lenses.
And what does an ultra-wide lens do physically?
Well, the physical mechanism of an ultra-wide lens is that it captures a massive field of view. But in doing so, it heavily distorts spatial relationships. It makes the background seem incredibly vast and imposing, while the subjects in the middle ground seem kind of small.
So by using a wide lens, the massive, brutalist concrete housing blocks actually look like they're bending around and swallowing the kids whole. It just dwarfs them.
Precisely. It emphasizes their total insignificance against the crushing weight of the state's architecture. It really drives home that lack of a way out.
But then, midway through the film, the trio travels into the center of Paris. And the visual language completely flips, doesn't it?
It does a total 180. In Paris, he stops using wide lenses and switches to long lenses, telephoto lenses.
Okay, and what does a long lens do?
It compresses space. It brings the background rushing right up behind the subject, throwing it completely out of focus. By doing this in Paris, Cassavetes deliberately denies the audience the sweeping romantic views of the capital.
So you don't see the majestic Haussmann buildings or the Eiffel Tower in grand, wide shots?
No, not at all. Instead, the city feels alien. It feels claustrophobic, out of focus, and deeply hostile to these three kids. The background is just this blur of wealth they are not allowed to touch.
That is just incredible visual storytelling. It perfectly illustrates the disconnect between the periphery and central Paris.
It is brilliant composition.
But here's what surprised me while watching clips of the film. You would think shooting a bleak, concrete housing project with wide lenses would just look depressing and static, yet there's so much kinetic energy.
Oh, definitely.
The camera is constantly moving, floating, almost dancing around the characters as they walk and argue.
That is the magic of the Steadicam. Cassavetes uses it to capture the vibrant, interconnected social life of the banlieue. He is showing the audience that despite the cold concrete, there is warmth.
Right, there is humor and a deep sense of community among these marginalized kids.
Exactly. The fluid camera moves with them, breathing with them. It integrates them into their environment.
But that fluid dancing camera stops the second the outside world looks at them.
It stops completely. Whenever the perspective shifts to how the state views these kids, the camera becomes rigid. It shifts to high-angle shots, looking down from rooftops or windows.
It pans and tilts mechanically rather than floating organically like a CCTV surveillance camera.
Yes. It is the cold, objective, emotionless view of authority. You have this constant visual tension, the warm, fluid, lived experience of the youth versus the cold, rigid, top-down surveillance of the state.
And binding all of this visual tension together is an audio motif, a ticking clock.
That ticking clock is so stressful.
It really is. Throughout the film's 24-hour narrative, a digital clock randomly flashes on the screen in stark white numbers, accompanied by the distinct sound of a bomb's timer ticking.
It acts as a relentless pressure cooker. It tells the audience, without a single line of dialogue, that an explosion is inevitable.
We are back to your opening parable of the falling man. That ticking clock is the ground rushing up to meet him. It creates a suffocating inevitability.
But let's look at who exactly is falling. Who are the people the state is monitoring with these surveillance angles?
Right. The core trio of the film is chosen very deliberately by Cassavetes. We have Vince, who is Jewish and white, Hubert, who is Black African, and Saeed, who is an Arab Muslim of Maghrebi descent.
They perfectly represent the black blank-board demographic black-white Arab. This was the exact multi-ethnic makeup of the working-class banlieues.
And the very existence of this trio, united in their marginalization, brings them into direct, violent conflict with the French Republican model of society.
Yes, and I really want to pause on this because it is crucial to understanding the social inequality here.
Okay, yeah, please clarify this French Republican model for me, because reading the sources, it operates very differently from what most people, especially in the US or the UK, are used to regarding race and identity.
It is fundamentally different. In the U.S., the societal model openly acknowledges a mosaic or a melting pot of diverse cultures.
Yeah.
You have hyphenated identities that are recognized and discussed. African American, Asian American, Irish American.
Right, the political system actually acknowledges distinct communities.
Exactly. But the French Republican model, which was born out of the ideals of the French Revolution, operates on a strict, unyielding, egalitarian system. It claims to be entirely blind to race, religion, and ethnicity.
I mean, it sounds beautiful on paper. The state says, we don't see color, we don't see religion, we only see French citizens, liberty, equality, fraternity for everyone, period.
On paper, it is a noble, unifying ideal. But the problem is reality. The state refuses to collect official census data on race or ethnicity, believing that doing so would be inherently discriminatory.
But wait, if you refuse to track race, you also blind yourself to systemic racism.
That is exactly the issue.
I was thinking about an analogy for this. It is like a doctor proudly refusing to look at a patient's medical history because they believe all patients should be treated equally.
Oh, that is a really good way to put it.
Yeah, it sounds fair to the doctor, but if the patient has a pre-existing condition, The doctor's going to prescribe the wrong medicine. Or they might ignore a massive internal bleeding issue because they refuse to acknowledge the specific reality of the person sitting in front of them.
That perfectly describes the systemic failure here. The state refuses to see the specific historical wounds of these marginalized communities, and the reality in the Banlieues just shatters the illusion of colorblind equality.
Right, because the data we do have is staggering.
Yes. The sources detail some shocking statistics. Unemployment among young people in these areas is often 80% higher than the national average. You have massive educational drop-off rates.
And studies show that a candidate with an Arab or African-sounding name is significantly less likely to get a job interview than a white candidate with the exact same resume.
So the system insists it is colorblind, but the economy and the police force clearly are not.
Which has to cause a massive psychological break for these kids. You are taught in school that you are equal, that you have the same rights, but the second you step outside, the police throw you against a wall because of your zip code and your skin color.
And this is where the sociological frameworks in your sources become vital. Sociologists actually have a name for that exact psychological breaking point. It is called anomie theory.
Developed by Emil Durkheim and later expanded by Robert Merton. Walk us through how this works mechanically in a teenager's brain.
Anomie occurs when there is a severe systemic disconnect between the cultural goals a society tells you to achieve, like wealth, respect, a good career, social status, and the legitimate means available to you to achieve them.
So the French educational system preaches equality and success to the youth of the Banlieues.
Right, but the reality of their segregated geography, their names, and the discrimination they face means all the legitimate doors are padlocked shut.
So if the legitimate doors are locked, but the societal pressure to succeed and gain respect is still there, you have to find an illegitimate door.
Exactly. You turn to subcultures, to rebellion, to the underground economy. You do it simply to gain some semblance of agency, respect, and identity.
They're in a state of anomie.
Yes, meaning normlessness, because the mainstream norms clearly do not apply to them, and this severely undermines the values of the republic we just talked about.
And this is heavily compounded by another framework the sources highlight, which is labeling theory.
Oh, labeling theory is huge here. It posits that people's behavior is significantly influenced by the terms used to describe or classify them. The media, the politicians, and the police constantly brand the Banlieue youth as racaille.
Meaning scum, thugs, dangerous outsiders.
Exactly. When the entire apparatus of the state labels you a violent threat from the day you were born, you begin to internalize that stigma. You realize that no matter how good you are, you will be seen as a monster.
So you start acting out the role of the monster, because at least a monster gets feared and respected. The society literally engineers the very threat it claims to be fighting.
And while these youth are spiraling into anomie, the dominant culture is watching this engineered threat and reacting with sheer terror. This perfectly explains the political trends we see in the sources.
Right, specifically the emergence and strengthening of the National Front in France.
The National Front, now known as the National Rally, is the extreme right-wing party. Their historical stated goal is the preference, protection, and unity of the country. But their implicit and often explicit definition of the country favors those of white Frankish descent.
They operate on a platform of protecting traditional French culture from the perceived twin threats of globalization and immigration.
Which is a political mechanism that is incredibly familiar to anyone following contemporary U.S. political discourse or, frankly, politics in half of Europe right now.
Yeah, the rhetoric is practically identical. It is all about protecting the real hardworking citizens from the invading outsiders, the push for extreme nationalism, the framing of borders as battlegrounds.
It relies on the most universal, primitive psychological trap, the U.S. versus them schema. Our sources reference the Holocaust survivor and writer Primo Levi, who warned about this exact phenomenon.
What do you say about it?
He wrote about the dangerous human tendency to reduce the incredibly complex river of human occurrences into a simple binary duel. Winners and losers, good guys and bad guys.
It is cognitive laziness, really. I mean, it is so much easier to ignore a complex housing and economic crisis if you simply decide the people suffering are them, the bad guys.
And once a society operates in that binary black and white mode, which again mirrors the cinematography of Haine, it strips away the humanity of the marginalized group.
It allows the dominant culture to manipulate fear, win elections, and justify extreme police violence, all under the guise of maintaining order.
But human beings are incredibly resilient. If the dominant culture locks you out of the VIP lounge and constantly tells you that you are worthless, You don't just sit there and accept it.
No, you adapt.
Wow.
You build your own culture, your own codes, and even your own language just to survive. Let's talk about the microaggressions of everyday life, starting with language.
Language is arguably the most profound tool for identity, especially in France. The French state fiercely protects its language. They have an actual official institution, the Académie Française, that dictates what is and isn't proper French.
But the youth in the banlieues bypass this entirely by speaking a slang called verlan.
Right, and verlan is fascinating.
I was actually trying to practice some of this before we recorded. Verlan is essentially a linguistic inversion. You take the syllables of a French word and you just flip them. So the French word for police, flic, becomes keuf. The word for crazy, fou, becomes oaf.
Exactly. And the word verlan itself is an inversion of the word l'envers, which means the reverse. Sociologically, this is a brilliant, instinctive act of linguistic rebellion.
How so?
By twisting the dominant, highly placed language, they are actively subverting the state's authority over them. They are creating a coded vernacular that the police, the teachers, and the politicians cannot easily penetrate.
It is a defense mechanism. They are essentially saying, you exclude us from your society, so we're going to exclude you from our conversations. It builds a cohesive, impenetrable identity among the youth.
And it unites them across racial lines. Whether you are black, Arab, or white, if you are from the banlieue, you speak verlan. You are united by class and geography.
Which brings up a really crucial distinction the film makes. It is not just about race. It is deeply about class. Let's look at Vince. Vince is a white Jewish kid. But there is a pivotal scene where the trio travels into central Paris and stumbles into an upscale bourgeois art gallery opening.
Oh, that scene is a masterpiece of sociological friction.
Right.
The three boys are suddenly thrust into this pristine, white-walled, high-culture Parisian environment. They attempt to interact with the women there, but they are aggressive, awkward, and completely lack the subtle, refined social codes of the bourgeoisie.
They don't know how to whisper. They don't know how to posture gracefully. They end up causing a massive scene and are violently kicked out into the street.
But it is not the fact that they get kicked out that's interesting. It is how they are dismissed. The gallery manager locks the glass door, looks out at them yelling in the street, and just shrugs.
And what does he say?
He turns to a guest and says, "The malaise of the ghetto."
That specific phrase is just devastating. He doesn't look at them as three individual young men who are simply misbehaving. He looks at them as a clinical, sociological phenomenon.
He pities them as symptoms of a diseased environment.
Wait, I really want to highlight this. He treats Vince, the white kid, with the exact same clinical detachment and disdain as Hubert, who is black.
Exactly.
It proves that while race is obviously a massive factor in their oppression, carrying the stain of the banlieue is what ultimately condemns them. The clothes, the accent, the posture, it marks them as a lower class. To the gallery manager, they aren't citizens. They are animals in a zoo acting up.
This raises an essential question about how the dominant culture patronizes the marginalized. The establishment doesn't even grant them the dignity of seeing them as equal adversaries. It just views them as a tragic public health issue.
And you see this internal war of identity perfectly encapsulated in the music of the film. We mentioned earlier that the camera uses a static, surveillance-style shot when viewing the kids from the state's perspective. Most famous example of this is the DJ cut killer scene.
Oh, visually and orally, that scene is incredible. The camera is looking down from a high window into the concrete courtyard, slowly panning across the buildings like a CCTV camera.
Right.
But what is happening in the window is an incredible act of cultural defiance. The DJ pushes his massive speakers right up to the glass and blasts his music over the entire project.
But what is he playing? He is scratching and mixing two completely opposed tracks. On one turntable, he's playing Edith Piaf's classic, sweeping French anthem.
Non, je ne regrette rien.
Which is the ultimate symbol of traditional, romantic, white France. Exactly.
Yeah.
And on the other turntable, he has the American rap group NWA's track, Fuck the Police.
It is a literal cultural collision happening in real time, broadcast over the concrete. The traditional assimilationist French culture they are supposed to bow down to is violently clashing with the imported, rebellious, angry American hip-hop culture.
And they identify with the American hip-hop culture because it actually speaks to their lived daily reality of police harassment.
It perfectly symbolizes the war within their own identities. And we have to talk about how this hyper-aggressive, survivalist culture dictates the gender dynamics of their world.
Because watching the film, it is glaringly obvious. There are almost no women.
Cassavetes was very deliberate about this. The women in the film are purposefully relegated to the deep background or pushed into corners. They act only as exhausted mothers or sisters who need to be protected.
There is absolutely zero romance in this movie.
None, which is shocking for a French film.
Right, but why? Why erase the women?
Because in an environment of advanced marginality, where you are constantly under threat from the police and crushed by the humiliation of structural unemployment, vulnerability is a fatal liability.
The streets require an impenetrable, hyper-masculine performance of toughness.
Exactly. Romance requires vulnerability. Therefore, romance is impossible.
Which brings us to the most famous shot in the entire film. Vince, standing in front of his bathroom mirror, he is shirtless, staring himself down, and he starts imitating Robert De Niro's character from Taxi Driver.
You talking to me?
Yeah. He points his finger like a gun saying, "You talking to me, you talking to me." He is acting out this explosive, violent fantasy all by himself.
That scene is the emotional thesis of the film. Look at his body language. It's rigid, explosive, terrifying. But it's a performance.
He is putting on this aggressive, untouchable armor because deep down, he knows he is utterly powerless.
The physical greetings between the characters, the explosive overlapping dialogue, the constant posturing, it is all armor. It masks their deep frustration and their inability to control their own destinies in a society that has locked them out.
But here's the terrifying reality. That internal war, that explosive posturing, isn't just cinematic. It doesn't stay confined to a black and white screen. It is bled out into the real streets of France over and over again.
The parable of the falling man is a real history lesson.
Let's look at the echoes in reality, from 1995 to today. Yeah. Because we have to remember that Haine was not born in a vacuum. It was a direct, visceral response to real violence.
Matthew Cassavetes actually began writing the script in 1993, specifically inspired by the real-life police shooting of a 17-year-old Zairian immigrant named Makome Mboul.
The details of that case are horrifying. He was shot point-blank in the head while handcuffed to a radiator in a Paris police station during an interrogation.
Cassavetes was outraged. And as the sources note, this wasn't an isolated incident. Between 1981 and the making of the film, there had been over 300 recorded bavures.
Bavures being a chillingly polite, almost dismissive French term for police slip-ups or blunders.
Yes. Downplaying systemic violence as clerical errors. Cassavetes wanted to make a film that acted as a Molotov cocktail to wake up the comfortable central Parisian middle class. He wanted to rub their faces in the reality of what the state was doing in their name.
And it certainly provoked a reaction. When the film premiered at the Cannes Film Festival in 1995, which is like the pinnacle of elite French culture, the police officers forming the security detail for the event literally turned their backs on Cassavetes and the cast as they walked up the red carpet.
The establishment felt indicted, and they were furious.
But the true tragedy of the film is its ongoing prophecy. Fast forward from the 1993 death of Makome to the summer of 2023. The world watched as massive violent riots erupted across France, specifically sparked in Nanterre, a Parisian suburb.
And what sparked it? The police shooting of a 17-year-old boy of Algerian and Moroccan descent named Nahel Merzouk during a routine traffic stop.
30 years separate Makome and Nahel, yet the mechanism of the tragedy remains absolutely identical. The cyclical nature of the Banlieue riots is devastating. The system learns nothing.
And when you look at the media coverage of the 2023 riots, our sources highlight a BBC report as a prime example. What do you see?
You see images of burning cars, smashed shop windows, lines of riot police bathed in tear gas, and uncontrolled violence. It looks exactly like the real news footage Cassavetes used in the opening montage of the film back in '95.
Exactly. The media only points its cameras at the Banlieues when they are quite literally on fire. This plays a massive role in perpetuating the othering and the labeling theory we discussed earlier.
By only ever showcasing the spectacular violence, the media cements the image of the residents as dangerous, feral thugs.
Rather than as marginalized citizens who have been pushed to the absolute brink, reacting to systemic oppression and literal bullets, it perfectly reinforces the far-right narrative that these areas are incubators of crime that must be heavily, violently policed.
It is a closed, self-sustaining loop. The police apply pressure, the community explodes. The media broadcasts the explosion out of context. The public gets terrified. The politicians win elections by promising to get tough on crime, and they demand more police pressure.
The cycle just resets. And in the middle of this crushing machinery, you have the youth demanding something, anything, to claim as their own. There's a brilliantly subtle moment in the film that speaks volumes about this desperate need for agency.
Oh, the billboard, yes. While the trio is wandering through the wealthy center of Paris, they walk past a massive advertisement for a luxury travel resort. The slogan on the billboard is, "Le monde est à vous." The world is yours.
Which is an homage to Scarface, but more importantly, it is an advertisement fundamentally targeted at the wealthy, dominant class. It is the promise of global capitalism to those who can afford the ticket.
But Saeed, the Arab character, pulls out a spray can. He doesn't destroy the billboard. He just changes one single letter. He crosses out the V and writes an N.
He changes "Le monde est à vous," meaning the world is yours, to "Le monde est à nous," the world is ours.
It is such a desperate, defiant demand for inclusion. They're geographically isolated, economically crippled, and structurally excluded from this glittering capitalist system. That quick tag of graffiti is them shouting into the void, "We are here, we exist, and we claim a piece of this reality."
But claiming it on a billboard hasn't changed the fundamental structure of the real world. In 2024, nearly 30 years after the film premiered, Mathieu Kassovitz adapted La Haine into a live stage musical in Paris.
But he made one crucial, heartbreaking update to the marketing. The original joke that opens the film, "So far so good," or "Jusqu'ici tout va bien," was changed.
It was updated to "Jusqu'ici rien n'a changé." So far, nothing has changed.
Imagine creating a piece of art so fundamentally accurate to the structural flaws of your society that 30 years later, the only update you need to make is to explicitly point out that the society learned absolutely nothing.
And reading through the modern sociological assessments in the stack, you could argue the atmosphere has actually darkened. It hasn't just stayed the same, it has mutated.
Mutated how?
Well, one of the original photographers for the film noted that the rebellion of the 1990s depicted in La Haine was largely secular. It was working-class youth against the police, and they were united across racial lines, the black, white, and Arab trio.
But today, the physical buildings look the exact same. But the social fabric within them has drastically fractured.
Exactly. The prolonged failure of the state to provide any meaningful integration or economic hope left a massive vacuum in these communities. And in some areas over the last 2 decades, that vacuum has been filled by political Islam and radical religious ideologies.
Which has led to deep, terrifying divisions. It culminated in the horrific terrorist atrocities we saw in 2015 with the Charlie Hebdo and Bataclan attacks. So religious politics really altered the dynamics.
Yes. The photographer noted a deeply depressing reality. If you tried to make a sequel to La Haine today, you likely couldn't even realistically depict a Jewish, black, and Arab kid as inseparable best friends.
Oh.
The religious and political fractures engineered by decades of neglect have deepened so much that a modern sequel wouldn't have that sliver of brotherhood and camaraderie. It would likely only be about pure, isolated despair.
That is incredibly bleak. The enemy didn't just cause rebellion, it metastasized into something much darker.
It did. The physical isolation built into the brutalist architecture in the 1950s, compounded by the lingering condescension of colonial attitudes, and perpetuated by a rigidly colorblind but systemically biased Republican model, has yielded exactly what enemy theory predicts.
Deviance, withdrawal, and ultimately cyclical violence. So we have taken quite a profound journey through these sources today.
We really covered a lot of ground.
We started by looking at the architectural traps laid post-World War II. Those concrete blocks specifically designed to keep the immigrant working class out of sight and out of mind.
And we explored the brilliant, suffocating visual language of Kassovitz, the poetic realism of the black and white starkness, the ultra-wide lenses that physically shrink the youth against the state's architecture, and that relentless ticking clock that promises disaster.
We unpack the psychological devastation of labeling theory. What happens when your own country's media and police brand you a thug from birth? We saw the desperate attempts to forge a protective identity through the linguistic subversion of our land.
And the hyper-masculine, explosive body language required just to survive.
And we arrived at the tragic reality that the fires of 1995 are still burning in the 2020s. From the police shooting of Mekome to the death of Nahel, the cycle of police violence and suburban rioting remains completely unbroken.
It just further fuels the rise of political extremes and tears at the very fabric of the nation. The blueprint of isolation functions flawlessly, generation after generation.
So as a listener, why should you care? If you don't live in France, if you have never taken a train to the Parisian suburbs, why does a 1995 French indie film matter to your life?
Because the mechanisms of exclusion we discussed today are completely universal.
Whether it is through restrictive zoning laws that push the poor to the edges of American cities, media representation that only shows minorities when they are in handcuffs, or Political rhetoric that relies on a us versus them fear tactic to win elections. These are the exact same tools.
The banlieues of Paris simply serve as a high-contrast magnifying glass. If you look closely through it, you will see the exact same fractures threatening the foundation of any modern democracy today.
The concrete might look different in your city, but the physics of a society in free fall are identical.
They really are.
I want to leave you with a final thought today. We spent this whole time returning to the parable that opens the film. The man falling from the 50-story building and the society watching him fall, listening to him desperately whisper, "So far, so good." But consider this. When an entire culture builds an economic and architectural system that purposefully pushes certain people off the edge through bad housing, closed economies, and constant policing, is the true crime the fall itself? Or is the true crime the fact that we have engineered our cities so well that the people safely on the ground don't even have to hear the impact?